A man pushes up a ridge in Peru in the summer of 1911, comes out on a terrace of cut stone, and finds a wall waiting for him. On the wall, written in charcoal, there is a name. It is not his. Under the name there is a year, and that is not his either. He copies it into his notebook. He writes down that this other man is the discoverer of the place. Then he goes home and becomes famous for finding it. That is the honest version of how a lost city gets found. Somebody was already standing on it. Usually somebody was farming it. Now hold that up next to the other kind. The cities nobody has ever stood on. No terrace, no charcoal, no wall, only a text. And there is one question about those cities that almost nobody asks, because it feels rude, and because it turns out to be very easy to answer. Not how old is the city. Cities and stories can be as old as they like. How old is the oldest surviving page that mentions it? Go and look. One by one. Check the date on the earliest thing anyone can actually hold in their hands. The sunken kingdom of unimaginable antiquity turns out to be documented later than the printing press. The hidden kingdom under Asia has no source older than a French occultist with a printing bill. That is the argument of this video, and I am putting it at the front, because it does all the work. Almost every famous lost city is documented far, far later than you have been told, and a small handful of the others were genuinely there and genuinely found. By the end, you will be able to sort those two piles on sight with one question. Start with the biggest one there is, Atlantis. There is exactly one ancient source. Two unfinished dialogues by one man, the Timaeus and the Critias, written by Plato in Athens around 360 before Christ. That is not the oldest source. That is the only source. Every other ancient mention of Atlantis is downstream of those two texts. No Egyptian inscription, no Babylonian tablet, no line in Homer. Nothing Minoan, nothing Phoenician, nothing before Plato at all. And the dialogues themselves tell you exactly where the story came from, which is the part nobody ever quotes. In the Timaeus, a man called Critias says he heard it as a boy, from his grandfather. The grandfather had it from Solon, the Athenian lawgiver. Solon had it from priests in Egypt at a temple in the delta city of Sais. 4 mouths before it reaches the page. A child, an old man, a poet-politician, and a foreign priesthood. Plato writes that chain out on purpose, and he gives the priest one of the great lines in Greek, "O Solon, Solon, you Hellenes are never anything but children, and there is not an old man among you." Then the scale. The war happened 9,000 years before Solon's visit. The island lay out beyond the pillars of Heracles. It was, the priest says, larger than Libya and Asia put together. Not a town, a landmass. And the end of it takes a single sentence. In one day and night of misfortune, the island of Atlantis disappeared into the depths of the sea. That is the entire evidentiary base. Everything ever said about Atlantis since is either commentary on those lines or invention. Which brings us to the thing the internet is certain about, and which the source flatly does not support. The claim is that Atlantis was a real sunken continent, and that it proves an advanced civilization existed before the flood and was wiped off the record. Look at what Plato actually does with it. His Atlantis is not a lost paradise of wisdom. It is the aggressor. It is a swollen naval empire that comes east to enslave the Mediterranean and is stopped by prehistoric Athens, which is the hero of the story. And Plato's own student read it that way. Aristotle is reported to have said that the man who invented Atlantis also sank it. But here is the detail that settles it. Plato hands you a receipt for his own story, and a documented pedigree is exactly what a Greek writer builds to make fiction feel like evidence. So where did the rest of it come from? The continent, the crystals, the antediluvian super race, the survivors seeding every pyramid on Earth. From a Minnesota congressman. In 1882, Ignatius Donnelly published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. Donnelly's thesis was that every known civilization descended from one drowned island. Same myths, same pyramids, same gods, one source gone. The book sold enormously. Almost every modern Atlantis idea you have ever heard is in it. None of it is in Plato. 6 years after Donnelly, Helena Blavatsky folded the island into theosophy. In the secret doctrine, the Atlanteans become the fourth root race of humanity. Hers peak roughly 1 million years back and destroy themselves misusing psychic powers. That is 100 times deeper in time than the figure Plato's priest gives. Then Edgar Cayce in the 20th century put a haul of Atlantean records under the Sphinx and announced the island would rise again in the 60s. So when somebody tells you the ancients knew about Atlantis, the accurate answer is that one ancient did. He wrote it himself, and he told you where he got it. Everything that makes it thrilling is Victorian. Now the opposite mistake. A legend that began with something real and grew a city on top of it. El Dorado. In Spanish, the phrase is not a place name. It is an adjective attached to a person, the Gilded One. It first surfaces in the record in the summer of 1539, in sworn testimony about an expedition leaving Popayan in search of a land they called El Dorado. 2 years after that, the chronicler Oviedo writes down what the Spanish over in Quito were actually saying to each other. They said there was a ruler who went about continually covered in gold dust as fine as ground salt, and washed off at night what he put on every morning. That is a man with a very expensive daily routine. There is no city anywhere in that sentence. By the 1580s, Juan de Castellanos ties the story to a specific people, the Muisca of the high Colombian plateau, and to a king anointed with resin and ground gold. And in 1636, Juan Rodriguez Freyla writes the version everybody now pictures. The lake has a name, Guatavita. The gilding is a coronation. Each new ruler is covered, floated out, and the gold goes into the water with him. Not a habit, an investiture. So is any of it true? Here the episode gets interesting, because for once there is an object. A farmer found it in a cave near Pasca in 1969. A small gold raft, under 20 centimeters long, cast in tumbaga, the local gold-silver-copper alloy. One large central figure standing on it, ringed by smaller attendants. Radiocarbon on charcoal from the casting mold puts it in the 14th or early 15th century. It sits today in the Gold Museum in Bogotá. It is not proof that the ceremony happened. It is the ceremony's exact shape, made by the people accused of performing it, long before any Spaniard arrived. So the Gilded Man has better evidence behind him than almost anything else in this video. And then the story leaves him behind, because a man is not worth an expedition. A city is. In 1596, Lawrence Kempis reports a lake called Paraíba, so vast the local people cannot tell it from the open sea, with a city on it called Manoa. Walter Raleigh carried that to England and sold it as an empire of gold. He went back for it, failed, and it eventually cost him his head. Watch the direction of travel. The evidence gets thinner as the prize gets bigger. The man is attested. The lake is hearsay. The city is a prospectus. Which is precisely what happened to another set of Spaniards, a continent north, chasing a legend they had brought from home in their luggage. Long before America, Iberian sailors talked about an island out in the Western Ocean called Antillia, and on that island, 7 cities. The story ran that when the Muslim armies took Spain, 7 bishops fled west by sea, and each of them founded one. And the island is not folklore. It is on maps. It appears unambiguously on a chart drawn by Juan Pizzigano in 1424. A big red rectangle in the Atlantic, dotted with 7 settlements. It stayed on the charts for most of a century, and Toscanelli cited it to Columbus's circle. Then Spain took Mexico, and the 7 cities went along overland into a desert. In 1539, a Franciscan called Marcos de Niza went north to find them. His scout, an enslaved African man named Estevanico, went on ahead. Estevanico reached the first pueblo and was killed there. Marcos, by his own account, never went in. He looked at the place from a hillside and turned around. His report said it was more extensive than Mexico City. He never once mentioned gold. His listeners supplied that part themselves. The following year, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado marched on Cibola with an army, and Cibola turned out to be Hawiku, a Zuni town of adobe, real, inhabited, and holding no treasure at all. Coronado's men called Marcos a liar to his face and sent him back to Mexico City in disgrace. The 7 cities were never in America. They were a medieval Atlantic legend, carried in the heads of the men doing the searching and stapled onto the first town they saw. And the projection runs the other way too, which is where this gets uncomfortable. Aztlan, the island homeland, the Mexica said they came from before they founded Tenochtitlan. It is in the codices. The Boturini Codex opens with a party leaving an island. The Aubin Codex says they were living under tyranny and fled. Duran's history says the Emperor Moctezuma the Elder sent men to find it, loaded with gifts, and told them to ask for the mother of his ancestors. That is a magnificent story, and here is the problem with using it as geography. Every one of those manuscripts was written after the Spanish conquest. Not one surviving Aztlan source is pre-Hispanic. Boturini, Aubin, the Mexicayotl Chronicle, Duran, all produced in a colonial world, in an alphabet brought by Cortés. That does not make the tradition invented. Oral memory is real. The migration story is clearly old, and the people telling it were describing themselves. It does mean the earliest page anybody can hold is on the wrong side of the conquest. Honest scholarship says so out loud. Now to the water. Europe has an entire family of cities that went under, and they are the cleanest demonstration of the dating trick in existence. West of Ireland, an island called hy-brasil. It appears on a Portolan chart by Angelino Dossert around 1325, and on the Catalan Atlas half a century later. Hold that date, because it matters. The island was on European charts long before any Portuguese ship reached the coast of South America. And hy-brasil is stubborn. In 1674, a Captain John Nisbet supposedly landed on it and met black rabbits and a magician. That account is a hoax, written by an Irish author named Richard Head, fiction with a captain's name on it, circulating as testimony. The island survives on British charts until 1865, by then shrunk to a hazard called Brazil Rock, sitting near a real shoal surveyed a few years earlier. That is a phantom's whole life cycle. Ink, then rumor, then hoax, then a rock, then nothing. Cross to Cornwall for lyonesse. The land said to have sunk between Land's End and the Isles of Scilly, except the name does not come from the sea at all. In French Arthurian romance, Lyonesse is where Tristan comes from, a kingdom on dry land that never drowns. The drowning is bolted on later by English writers who needed the name to sit somewhere near Cornwall, and there was water conveniently to hand. And the sea did rise there. Modern survey work confirms the Scillies were once one large island and drowned into an archipelago. That is geology. It is not a city. Tennyson finished the job. He set Arthur's last battle in Lyonesse, and after that nobody could hear the name as anything but a sunken kingdom. Down the coast to Brittany and to Sais, the city behind the seawall. King Gradlon holds the only key. His daughter opens the gates and the ocean comes in. So when is this written down? Gradlon and the city turn up in Pierre Lebeau's Breton Chronicle in the 1480s, but the daughter is not in it. Dahout, the key, the entire moral engine of the story, first appears in an edition of Albert Legrand's Breton Saints' Lives from 1680. And the devil, the seduction, the version in every children's book is fixed by Émile Silvestre in a collection of Breton hearth tales published in 1844. So the drowned Celtic city of immemorial antiquity assembles itself piece by piece across the age of print in front of us, which leaves the strangest of them. Kitezh, the city that went under a lake in Russia rather than surrender. The story is set in 1238, while the Mongol armies are burning their way through the Rus principalities. The city sinks into Lake Svetloyar. The pure of heart can still hear its bells under the water, and the worthy are let in. The earliest text is anonymous. It is called the Kitezh Chronicle, and it was composed among Old Believers in the 1780s. Set those two dates against each other, and the gap is 5.5 centuries. And the writers were a persecuted church hiding from their own government. That is not a memory of a Mongol siege. That is a community writing about itself and choosing a drowned city as the shape of its own hope. East now and up. Shambhala, the hidden kingdom in the mountains. Its source is real and it is Buddhist. Shambhala is described in the Kalachakra Tantra, whose Sanskrit text and great commentary were completed in the 11th century of our era. Not immemorial, medieval. In the text, it is a kingdom under a line of kings, and it is waiting for one of them in particular. The 25th, Rudra Kalkin, is prophesied to ride out at the head of an army and end the age. That is apocalyptic literature with a map attached. Then the West gets hold of it. Theosophy claims it. Nicholas Roerich crosses Central Asia on expeditions looking for it twice between the wars. And in 1933, a British novelist called James Hilton publishes Lost Horizon and invents a valley named Shangri-La. Shangri-La is not a myth. It has an author, a publisher, and a copyright date. A great deal of what people now believe about Shambhala came out of that novel, which is the soft version of what happened to Agartha, the kingdom under the earth. That one has no source at all. Not a late source. None. The name does not appear anywhere before the 1870s. It shows up in a book by a French colonial official, Louis Jacoliot, who said Brahmin friends had shown him manuscripts. Nobody has ever produced the manuscripts. Saint-Yves d'Alvedre wrote it up as a subterranean world government. His book was printed, pulled within a fortnight, and only published after he died. Then Ossendowski put it in a best-selling travel book after the First World War, and denied that he had read the earlier one. Agartha is not ancient wisdom out of the East. It is 19th century European occultism in a Sanskrit-shaped costume. Two more, and these are honestly hard because they sit between the piles. Tartessos, a wealthy kingdom beyond the Pillars of Heracles, named by Greeks with no obvious reason to invent it. Herodotus tells of a Samian ship blown past Gibraltar that came home richer than any Greek before it. Elsewhere, the king there, Arganthonios, pays for a foreign city's wall. That is a Greek historian writing about a place other Greeks traded with. It is a completely different class of evidence from a dialogue about the ideal state. And the city has never been found. A German archaeologist spent years digging the marshes at the mouth of the Guadalquivir for it and came up with nothing. But the civilization is right there. Cancho Roano, the great site at Casas del Turunuelo, under excavation for the last decade, with carved stone faces coming out of the fill. So Tartessos is real and its capital is missing. Those are two separate sentences, and you must never let anyone merge them into one. Same shape in Arabia. The Quran, in the chapter of the dawn, asks whether you have not seen how your Lord dealt with the people of Ad, of Iram, of the lofty pillars. Commentators have argued over that phrase ever since. A city, a district, or simply the name of a clan with tall tent poles. The verse does not settle it. Ubar is a separate tradition, out of later Arabic geography and story collections. Westerners welded the two together and called the result the Atlantis of the sands. In 1992, a team tracing caravan tracks on satellite imagery announced they had found it at a place called Shistar in Oman, where a fort had dropped into a sinkhole. The papers ran it as a lost city. Shistar is real and important. It is also a fortified well on a trade road that oil company geologists had already logged, and it had never been lost. So what does it look like when a city genuinely is found? 3 answers, and not one of them looks like the movies. Troy. The Iliad is poetry, and for a long time educated opinion held that the city was poetry too. A Scottish journalist argued for the right mound in Turkey in 1822. An English consular family bought part of it and began digging 4 decades later. Frank Calvert had the site right before Schliemann ever arrived. Schliemann had the money and the newspapers, and he dug there from 1870. And he dug straight past it. The hoard he pulled out and named after Priam comes from a layer roughly 1,000 years too early for any Trojan War. The layers now argued over sit much further up the mound. The site is real. The identification is real. The romance was wrong about which floor it was on. Pompeii next, and Pompeii is the best joke in archaeology. In 1592, an engineer cut a water channel straight through the buried city. He hit painted walls and inscriptions and said nothing about it. Serious digging began a century and a half later. And even then, nobody was sure which town they were standing in, until an inscription came out of the ground naming the Pompeians' own republic. The city told them what it was called. And back to that ridge in Peru. Machu Picchu was under vegetation, not under a myth. Families were farming its terraces when the explorer walked in. The charcoal on the wall carried a Peruvian name and a date, 9 years before his own visit. He copied it out and wrote that this man was the discoverer. Later in print he explained that he had discovered it the way Columbus discovered America, which is a very carefully built sentence. So here is the sorting rule, and it costs you nothing to use. A city that was really there leaves paperwork while it is alive. Tax records, trade complaints, a neighbor's inscription, a road going to it. A city that was never there arrives already lost, already golden, already sunk, already hidden, and its earliest page is centuries younger than the age it claims for itself. Atlantis has one author. El Dorado was a man before it was ever a map. Agartha has a publication date. None of that makes the stories worthless. It makes them evidence about the people who wrote them, instead of the places they describe. And that is a better haul than gold. Ask Raleigh.